Hi, writers. This is the first part one of the presentations on how to use, incorporate, and cite sources. This is focusing on MLA format. Keep in mind, please, that this is a supplementary lesson to the readings in your textbook. So I will not go over every single thing because a lot of what you need to know is also in your textbook. So make sure that you've done the reading, that you have your textbook handy to reference as we go. This is from Practical Argument. We'll talk about this several times in this course because it's really important to knowing what to document to avoid plagiarism. So of course, most of us know anytime we use an actual quotation, a word-for-word quotation from a source, we put it in quotation marks, and of course, we document the source of that quotation. But a lot of students struggle with the idea too that we also document and cite summaries and paraphrases. So even if we're putting a source's main points or ideas in our own words, using our own language, we still have to cite where that idea came from because it's not our original idea. That's part of the academic world, is that when you get an idea from someone else, you give credit to the person who thought of that idea. Of course, any statistics, but also any visuals or anything that you're citing from a chart or a graph also needs citation. Again, that was somebody else's labor, somebody else's work to do that study, to create those visuals. So including creative work and ideas, including statistics, including charts, graphs, or any data that you take and extrapolate from those things. I really like this flowchart. It's really handy for a quick reminder of what needs to be cited. Is it in another person's words? If so, we quote and cite it. Is it another person's ideas? Even if you put it into your own words, you do need to cite it. Except if it's what we call common knowledge, which is addressed in the second half of this flowchart. Common knowledge is any basic fact that's not somebody's particular academic labor or somebody's specific idea. So for example, that Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president, that he was born in whatever year, in whatever state. Those things are not going to vary based on who's writing the text that's reporting that information. So since that's just a basic fact, we can call that common knowledge. Common knowledge is also something sort of experiential that most people know just from living in this world, such as, skinny jeans were popular a few years ago, but now wide leg jeans are coming back into popularity. You don't need to cite a source for that because it's just what we call common knowledge. Most of us living in this world, in this culture, in this society know that. Now, also very important to know is where in our writing we document those sources. So the first place we document sources is in our actual paper. Whenever we call in those sources, we include an in-text citation, a citation in our actual text. We call it a parenthetical citation as well because it goes into parentheses, as you can see here in this example. Rifkin 2 is a source. In this case, it's an actual quotation. So right after the quotation marks end, here comes the parenthetical in-text citation. We also then include every source we cite on our works cited page. And that's what works cited refers to. The works that we cited within our text, we then compile in the works cited page. So now we're going to talk more specifically about how we actually incorporate those quotations. When we're using a quote, when do we use a quote? What does that look like? When we're paraphrasing, when do we choose to do that? What does that look like? What does the citation look like? Practical Argument Chapter 9 has a lot more detail on these things, so I'm going to hit some key points, but please remember this slide presentation does not replace your reading of Chapter 9. Instead, it's meant to supplement it. So first of all, deciding when you should summarize, quote, or paraphrase. Whenever you are pulling in a source for the first time, you want to introduce that source with a brief summary. So a phrase, a sentence, just to say what this source is and what they're talking about overall in this source. And then you would give a quote or a paraphrase of something that's specific that happened in that thing. So we summarize to introduce a source for the first time or to give the overall sense of an important theory or study. And so we're going to summarize the whole study, right? We choose to quote word for word from the author when the phrase itself is really essential to the main idea. So I like these S words here when the phrase that the original author and the source use is very stylistic, it's very striking or surprising or startling. And we want to keep the author's original language. Or when their writing voice is really important to preserve. So for example, if they're writing in a particular dialect, if they said it in a really rhetorically powerful way, or if it's a really essential key point. In that case, we should quote. However, we really want to avoid over-quoting. Oftentimes, a lot of times, instead of using the author's exact words, we instead want to paraphrase, which means to take a key idea and put it in your own words. However, we still cite it. All of these types of source usage are still cited. So we choose to paraphrase when it's an important concept or fact, but the way it's phrased in the source isn't particularly, intriguing or interesting. So the language of the original source isn't really important to maintain. Paraphrasing can also help us break down a complex concept by putting it into words that are more simple and easier for the reader to understand. A good mature paper will include all three of these types of source usage, and that's definitely something I'm looking for now that we're in Comp 2. I want to see you using each of these types of skills so that we can practice and get better at these different types of source usage. And remember, of course, regardless of whether you're summarizing, quoting, or paraphrasing, we still cite those sources, both in text and including those sources on the Works Cited page list. I want to as well take a look at the sample paper that that practical argument includes to show you what these citations look like in real time. So here we have a citation. This is an integrated quote. It's just embedded in the language here. So we have the quote. Now, normally in an MLA in-text citation, we would expect to see the author's last name. In this case, the paper, Online Behavior, does not have an author. So what comes next is whatever comes first in the citation here on the Works Cited page, because the in-text citation should always lead me straight to that source. So Online Behavior is cited, and that means I can come here and find Online Behavior. And here we have one. Now look at this one, please. This does not include a direct quotation. However, it does include a paraphrase. So this is a paraphrase of an idea, but it is still cited. This one is just Preston. What that means is that this is not a paginated source. This source did not have page numbers, so we do not include the page numbers. So when I come down here to look, I should be able to find the source beginning with Preston, yes, and then I can find it if I need it. So whatever is cited in the in-text citation should match exactly to the first word or words in the Works Cited citation. One key rule when we are incorporating quotations into our work is to avoid dropped quotations. And a dropped quotation is what we call a quotation that does not have any supporting introductory material. So here, there is an introductory sentence, but you can see here the quotation itself is separate from that sentence. It's just dropped straight into the text. It is cited correctly, but it needs an introductory phrase to introduce the quote within the same sentence. Now this one you might think is correct because it does have a comma instead of a period leading into the quotation. However, grammatically, this is a sentence. Grammatically, unsurprisingly, most cats prefer fish tacos. That should end with a period because that's a sentence. This is a grammatically incorrect. So this is essentially still a dropped quotation. Just wanted to make you aware of that. If grammatically your sentence ends here, you're not really smoothly integrating your quote. And I do see that on student papers, and you may get a comment on that if you do that type of error. So instead of dropping a quotation, the way that we fix that is making sure to integrate our quotations into our writing. So here we go. We have a little bit more information about the author here. The author of According to Kat. So we call this a signal phrase. It signals who the author is. And in this case, we even include some contextual information, the book it comes from. And then we have this verb here. So it could be suggests, implies, argues. and then comma. So this is a sentence that flows grammatically well and sounds good. Yusuf Smith, the author of According to Cats, suggests cats gravitate toward fish tacos because of their delightfully fishy taste. So the quotation begins. Here you'll notice the citation has changed to just the page number, and that's because we just already told you the author's name. So if we've used the author's name in the same sentence, we only need to include the page number here. So instead of a dropped quotation, we want to make sure that we're smoothly integrating our quotations. I like to use the quote sandwich metaphor because it helps remind us that a quote should never stand alone. It should never just be plonked on into the paper. You have to do work on both sides of a quote or a paraphrase every time you use one. So before we pull in a quote, we introduce the source, often giving a brief summary if it's our first time using that source. We say who the author is. We might say where it was published, what type of source it was. And we also include an attributed tag and that verb leading into the quote. Then we give our quote, and of course we cite our quote. And then after every quote, we explain a little bit about how that quote supports the point you're trying to make, what you want your readers to get from that quotation. A quote needs support on both sides because quotes do not speak for themselves. So every time you incorporate a quote in a paper, I'm going to be looking for that quote sandwich. A really nice introduction, the quote itself, the citation, and then coming in afterwards and giving a little bit of explanation as to what you want your readers to understand about that quote. The best way to incorporate a quote is to use one of these things we call signal phrases or identifying tags. Same concept, two different vocabularies to talk about it. According to the author is one basic key way to introduce a quote. Now this one here has a little bit of contextual information too. Who is this guy? And that can add authority, credibility, a little bit of context for your reader. So adding some context, especially the first time you pull in a quote, is a great thing to do. He said, it's a good social policy. We have the page number, only the page number since we already used the author's name here, and then a period after we end the in-text citation. We can also use this verb. So Jerome Skolnick argues that the policy is effective. Now here, keep in mind, this is a paraphrase. It's not the exact quote. It's in our own words, but it's still his idea. So we do still cite the source, even if it's a paraphrase. Practical Argument has a blue box, templates for using identifying tags, and that box is really helpful to help you find some different ways to phrase these identifying tags. Looks a little bit like this. So for summaries, paraphrases for quotations, as the writer believes, observes, warns, reports, points out. So different verbs here that you can use to construct these identifying tags and signal phrases. Just make sure you're being accurate. So if it's not an argument essay, you probably don't want to use argues. You may want to use suggests or explores or states instead. So make sure you choose a verb that accurately represents what's going on. You can also integrate a quote by just embedding it into your own sentence. So here, there's no verb like suggest that tells us, if we were reading this out loud, that, oh, here comes a quote. Instead, it's just embedded into our own language. The reason most cats prefer fish tacos is, quote, because of their delightfully fishy taste. So in this case, it's just sort of very smoothly embedded, which can sound a little less clunky because it's grammatically integrated into a sentence that you've already begun to construct. But again, still, we do the citation, we quote correctly. So these are sort of two ways that you can incorporate these quotes. You can use the signal phrase, or we can integrate by embedding into your own sentence that you've already started. So I want to also now talk about how to construct that parenthetical citation. So we know in MLA format, the basic standard in-text citation includes two things. This is really important for you to know. The author's last name, space, the page number. There are some special circumstances though. What if there's no author? What if you already used the author's last name? So we're going to talk about a few of those special cases, but please note the textbook has almost every special case listed with a visual of what that would look like and instructions on what to include. So I'm going to let the textbook speak for a lot of this because it's all right there for you, and it would take a very long time to go over every single one of those that you may or may not encounter. So the first special case is if you've already used the author's last name, you don't need to repeat it. We've talked a little bit about that. We use the author's last name, so we only include the page number here. Another special case is what if there's a work with 2 authors? It would look like this. What if there's a work with no author? We talked about this a little in the example. You would instead include the first few words of whatever comes next in the work cited, generally the title of the article, in quotes, space, page number. If it is a quote that the source is already using, we call that an indirect quotation, and it looks like this. So your signal phrase would include whoever actually said the quote, and then your parenthetical citation would do quoted, QTD period, in the author's last name, and then the page number. What if it's a work without page numbers? In that case, we only use the author's last name. So there are all of these examples and more in your textbook. So please use your textbook as a reference there. Now remember the end of the quote sandwich. So we've talked about how to introduce the quote, how to cite the quote, and then we need that final bun to wrap up our sandwich. So don't forget to come in and explain how the evidence is significant and how it supports your argument. You can ask yourself some of these questions, but you do need to explain how that quote matters to the argument that you are making. And so I want to show you a little bit of how this source sandwich will look. So here is a paragraph, a body paragraph on the gender gap in STEM fields. So here we have a paraphrase. So this is a really nice paraphrase. Notice it's taking 2 sentences. So actually this first sentence is probably like a summary. And then this sentence is the specific idea that they're pulling from that text. So they have cited correctly here. So we have the summary, the paraphrase, the citation. And then after the paraphrase, we have here, since these stereotypes have been ingrained, girls will likely start to believe these stereotypes and not pursue a career in STEM fields. So this is them explaining why that paraphrase matters to their argument, or like what the significance is to their argument. So whenever you incorporate either a paraphrase or a quote, I'm going to look at the sentences that precede it and the sentences that come after it and make sure it's really nicely sandwiched, not just plonked in there.